right, well, welcome back. I was on campus yesterday, and it was completely dead, quiet, nothing. College campuses are not made to not have people on them. So it's so much fun to have you all back, ready to go here to finish up the semester. We're going to finish strong, right? We got 3 weeks. Everybody's ready to get it done. And then you get another break for a few weeks. So you can do it. 3 weeks, that's all you got. All right, so let's get started, get back into things here. I've got to have you, always have to have you do some kind of assignment. So let's do this. Stand up. I think it works better if you stand. You need to get a partner. You can have 2 or 3, maybe 4 if you want. We're going to play a little family feud here. Now, I've got to modify it a bit. See if we got, oops, got to turn my thing on. There we go. All right. So here is our topic, our category, the things people fear the most. Now, I didn't have an exact number of people surveyed. I took this survey from off the internet, which of course is always 100% right, we know. And so we'll do it backwards. We'll start with number 6 and just kind of work our way down. So I want you, with your partners there, to figure out 6 things that people fear the most, and then we'll see how well you did. All right, I'll give you like a minute to do that. Now, I know there's a lot of enthusiasm. I probably should have said at the beginning, there is no prize, so sorry. The prize is knowing, you know, the reward you get here in front of all your friends. All right, we're ready. Number 6. Who has spiders or insects? All right, good. Raise your hand. That's good. Good. All right. Number 5. Flying. Yeah, yeah. That is so true. Last February, my wife and I had the privilege of escorting 3 of our current CSU students, and they know who they are, so I got to be careful how I say this. For a couple of them, it's the first time they ever flew. There is a real sense of people being afraid of flying. Number 4, snakes. Who had snakes? All right. Number 3, going to the dentist. Yeah. I have a love-hate relationship with my dentist. He's a dear friend, but I hate it when he starts poking me. Number 2, fear of heights. And the number 1 answer is, what do you think? How about public speaking? Yeah. All right, you can sit down. Anybody get them all right? We got a group back there did? All right, very good, very good. Yeah, there are some of you that wouldn't be caught dead standing up here like I am right now, and I'll admit, you know, I've done this enough that I'm probably over the big fear of it, but there is always a certain anxiety and a certain, maybe we would call it fear, to get up in front of people, because the main thing is, the biggest thing that every one of us is afraid of is that we don't want to look stupid in front of all of our friends, right? We don't want to do something dumb up here so that people will laugh, and you know, we have this kind of fear of what people will think about us. Well, we're going to be talking about fear today, and fear is a weird emotion. We tend to think of it as a negative thing. And certainly, as you know, we saw up here, that can be very true. You know, there's kind of this irrational fear that people can have about things maybe they shouldn't really be that fearful of. But there also is a good fear, and a fear of things that we should be a little bit nervous about, things that we should be concerned about. And so that's what we're going to talk about today, the difference between that irrational fear and what the Bible will call a good fear. So, for example, we had our 6-year-old, we had our whole family in for Thanksgiving, and a part of our family is our 6-year-old grandson. And his parents are trying to teach him there's certain things he needs to be afraid of, which is very hard for him because he really is a fearless person. When he was 3 years old, he was jumping off the high board at the swimming pool. And he couldn't swim, but he could doggy paddle like nuts. His grandmother, my wife, would be like, ah, and he'd be, and he's finally learned how to swim, but the boy is afraid of nothing. So at some point, you have to teach them there are certain things that you need to be a little bit afraid of. So they live on a street that there are not a lot of houses on it. They're one of the first ones on there, and they have one neighbor that lives beside them, but there's more houses being built on their street, thus more traffic. Well, he's at the age where he can ride his bike and get out on the street and ride his little scooters and all that good stuff. And for a long time, he didn't have to worry about cars coming up and down the street, but now he does. And he has to learn that you can't just run out on the street in the, chasing a ball or riding your bike or doing whatever. So there's a healthy fear that all of you have experienced and your parents have showed you and helped you to learn. There are just some things you need to be smart about and some things you need to be very cautious about. The Bible talks about this as well. This is a fascinating verse. It's a verse that I came across a few years ago, and it's one of them I had not thought about. I'm sure I'd read it many times, but I'd never really given it much thought until I was listening to somebody speak about it, and they really emphasized the first one up there on the top, the sin whispers to the wicked, deep within their hearts. They have no fear of God. Look at the different translations there. It's an interesting verse. Sin whispers, transgressions speak to the wicked deep in their heart. And the old King James says, an oracle from within my heart concerning the transgressions of the wicked. I have a message from God in my heart concerning the sinfulness of the wicked. And what is this verse saying? Quite explicitly, without a proper fear in our hearts, sin controls us. Sin whispers. And it's funny to think about sin. It usually doesn't scream out in neon signs and all that kind of stuff. It begins with whispers in our hearts and in our minds. It's okay. Nobody's going to see you cheat on that test. Don't worry about it. They don't know how to find Wikipedia. Our professors are old. Just copy it out of there, put it in your paper. AI is a wonderful tool. Or how about we just take a ride? Nobody's going to see us in the back of that car. How about if I just smoke this thing, drink this stuff? Nobody's going to know. And here's the problem. You're probably right. Sin whispers in our heart. And it begins to convince us that these things, these temptations, are going to be okay. No one else is going to see that. Nothing's going to happen. No one's going to know what's going on. And it's funny, it's interesting, in Proverbs chapter 5, God will tell us, and he warns the reader of Proverbs, be careful what you do, because God sees everything. You see, we may not see you doing it. Your friends may not see you doing it. Your parents may not see you doing it. Nobody. But God knows everything. God sees it. If you have no fear of God, then you know what? Go ahead. No one's going to see it. There's nothing to stop you. End of the day, we cannot police you. Your friends cannot police you. Your parents, it doesn't matter. End of the day, the only thing that you really have that will stop you from sinning when you shouldn't is a fear of God. That's a good fear. That's a healthy fear. We're going to unpack that term today because I think it is so important for us as followers of Christ to understand this concept and what it means. Whoops, I didn't mean to do all that. I'm not sure what happened there. Can you put me back on that third slide, Josh? There we go, thank you. Proverbs chapter 3 is where we're going to go. Now, got to back up a little bit. Several years ago, when I started having opportunities to speak in chapel because of my role here, and I get an opportunity to speak a couple times a semester, and it's kind of weird because when you don't speak a lot but you have opportunities, it's always kind of hard to know what you want to speak about. It's really one of the bigger issues in the whole process. And so I just decided from my own study that I would begin to work my way through the book of Proverbs whenever I had the opportunity to speak. And so that's where we're doing it today. And we're actually picking it up in chapter 3, and I'm picking up a message that I started, I think it was 4 years ago now, maybe 5, and never finished. So we're going to pick it up and do that again today. Now, this study started for me. Actually, it was the year 1997. I was sitting in an open field in northern Mexico, right outside of Tijuana, Mexico, having my morning devotions while I was on a mission trip with our youth group. And I know it was June 23rd because my devotions that day, or at that time, I was just simply reading through the book of Proverbs. And I came across this verse in Proverbs 23:23 that struck me and has kind of become a life verse for me ever since. That was 26 years ago, where the writer of Proverbs tells us to buy truth and do not sell it. Buy wisdom, instruction, and understanding. And essentially that's the message of the entire book of Proverbs. The entire book is about wisdom. It's about the truth that God reveals to us through these various sayings and illustrations that the author, Solomon mainly, and others give to us in the book of Proverbs. And so I set out on a mission that day to commit myself to becoming a student of the Proverbs because I want to live wisely in this world. And it's an ongoing process. So let's back up from there. In Proverbs chapter 1, we find out what wisdom is. If you had a chance, if we had time, we could look through verses 2 through verses 6, and you see several different terms there that describe wisdom. Each one is a little bit nuanced, and it gives you a different aspect to what wisdom is. We don't have time today to look at each one of them, so I'm just going to ask you to take it by faith. This is my conclusion of what wisdom, or how wisdom is defined in Proverbs 1. The right truth. Let's stop there for a minute. You will not know wisdom if you don't know the truth. And what truth are we talking about here? Not the truth that 1 and 1 is 2, although that is true. We're talking about the truth of the Scriptures, the truth of the Bible. You cannot be wise, you cannot live wisely in this world without being a student of God's Word. But being a student of God's Word is not enough. The world is full of people much smarter than me that know much more about it than I do, who do and live foolish lives, which is the opposite of wisdom in the book of Proverbs. Because there's a next stage to it, and that is that truth has to be applied in the real world at the right time. All of you have probably experienced this at some point or another, where somebody has said, in trying to comfort you in the middle of a crisis or maybe a real tragedy, something that's happened that's very difficult to deal with. I've served for many years as a pastor, and one of the duties, responsibility of a pastor is to just be beside people in their moments of crisis, in their moments of tragedy. And I learned real early that there wasn't a whole lot that I could say that was going to make them feel any better. And as a matter of fact, I didn't really need to say anything. You just needed to be there and to comfort and to help and to be with them in that time. And one of the dumbest things we can do when somebody's going through something like that is to give them our Christian platitudes like, God is sovereign, he's in control, it'll be all right. When a parent is there laying their child in a grave, they know God is sovereign. They know God is in control. They don't need to hear you remind them of that. Or when somebody has had a difficult breakup, a relationship thing, a marriage, a family, something has happened, there's no platitudes that are going to make them feel any better. In time, there might be some things you need to discuss. There might be some right words that need to be said. You see, wisdom is the right truth in the real world with real people and real circumstances at the right time. That's why when you read Proverbs, there's all kinds of statements. You kind of wonder what he's saying about this. And several times, some themes are said over and over again in different ways. The right truth in the real world at the right time. That's wisdom, and I think that's what Solomon is telling us in Proverbs chapter 1. In chapter 2, we move into a bigger explanation, and there's a reason that I have that picture of a treasure chest up there, which is a little distorted. I don't know if you can see it there that well. But Solomon tells his son, he says, my son, if you accept my words and store up my commandments within you, turn your ear to wisdom and applying your heart to understanding, and if you call out for insight and cry aloud for understanding, and if you look for it as for silver and search for it as a hidden treasure. How do you look for your phone when you've lost it? Yeah, exactly. Every one of us do. So much of our world is built around our phones now, right? That's the idea that Solomon is communicating to his son here. You look for that thing with desperation because you know your world is so tied up in that thing. Whether that's a good thing or not, I don't know. I'll save that for another day. But that's the spirit of what he's saying here. Like a treasure, we're to seek wisdom. And then he goes on in verses 5 and 6 in chapter 2, and he says, and then you will understand the fear of the Lord. Now this is a theme that we're going to unpack today, so keep that in mind as we keep going forward here. Then you'll understand the fear of the Lord and find the knowledge of God. For the Lord gives wisdom, and from his mouth comes knowledge and understanding. And so what I'm trying to communicate here in this visual is that when we try to seek wisdom, or when we seek wisdom, what we're going to find is God. Because God is the author of all wisdom. He is behind all wisdom. That's what Solomon is telling his son here. And as a matter of fact, when we find God, we will also find wisdom. Wisdom is always pointing to where God is always leading. And so Solomon's beginning to develop this process with his son. And we get to chapter 3, and some people, in my Bible, it's called the benefits of wisdom at the beginning of that chapter. I probably would rename it a little bit differently. I might call it the theology of wisdom, maybe the God-centeredness of wisdom. But it's the idea that if you are going to have wisdom, then there's a centrality to that process of knowing who God is. And so he starts out I'll start in verse 1 if you're following along. He says, my son, you hear that the second time we've heard that? He's talking to his son. Do not forget my teaching. Pay attention, son. Don't forget what I'm saying to you here. Keep my commandments in your heart, for they will prolong your life many years and bring you prosperity. He's not teaching a prosperity theology there, but he's teaching him if you live by wisdom, life will go well for you. Doesn't mean easy. That's never a promise of Scripture, but it will go well because you're pursuing the right things. Let love and faithfulness never leave you. Bind them around your neck. Write them on the tablet of your heart. Then you will win favor and a good name in the sight of God and man. You see, son, one of the products of living wisely is you're going to have a good reputation. You're going to be known as a good person, not only to God, which is obviously extremely important, but also to each other, to your fellow human beings. Then we pick it up here in verse 5, which is where I'm emphasizing things today. Trust in the Lord with all your heart. Lean not on your own understanding. In all your ways acknowledge him, and he will make your path straight. Now that's a passage that many of you have heard and claimed and talked about. And I'm not going to unpack it today because it's leading to where I want to go here. But I do have to mention it. So the first place that Solomon starts as he tries to convince his son the importance of him focusing on God to build his wisdom and understanding of life so that he will have a good reputation, so that he will be a good person, so he will be a wise person. First, you trust in God, not in yourself. And so back when I preached this before, the conclusion was, the application was, and what are you trusting? Are you trusting in yourself? Or are you truly trusting in God? And the truth is, that's a daily battle for every one of us. No matter how long you've studied wisdom, my 26 years ago is older than most of you here in this room. To whatever age you are, it doesn't matter. It's a daily battle of us setting aside our selfish desires, ambitions, goals, thoughts, whatever they may be, and putting God first. Well, how do we do that then? Well, he goes on, and he says this in verse 7. And one of the keys to that process, where we started today, is the idea of a proper fear of God. A proper understanding of our relationship to God. Why should we trust God? He begins to answer it here in verses 7 and 8. He says, do not be wise in your own eyes, or don't be impressed with your own wisdom, which is really a foolish thing to do. I could go off on that. I'll stop there for now. Don't be impressed with your own wisdom. You're not as smart as you think you are. None of us are. Instead, fear the Lord and turn away from evil. This will bring health to your body and strength to your bones. That idea again, not necessarily for prosperity, but a good life. A life that is rewarding, a life that is satisfying, a life that is a light to other people, a life that is honoring to God, a life that reflects who he is here in this world. You see, there's a healthy fear. And the text forces us to deal with this concept. And this idea of fear of the Lord is presented 19 different times in the book of Proverbs alone, and close to 100 times in the Old Testament itself, especially in the wisdom literature. You will not be wise, you cannot have wisdom without understanding what a proper fear of God is. Make sure I get the right thing here because I don't want to lose the importance of this. So the fear of the Lord is mentioned in Proverbs chapter 1. I said the definition of Proverbs or wisdom comes in verses 2 through 6. And then really the climax of what wisdom is comes in verse 7. And it says the fear of the Lord is the beginning, it is the foundation of knowledge. And knowledge is kind of a synonym for wisdom in that text. The idea that you will not be wise without a proper fear of God. And then he begins to add to that here in verse 7 of chapter 3. Instead, fear the Lord and turn away from evil. So if we fear God, that sin that begins to whisper in our heart can be dealt with, can be turned away from, because we have a proper fear and understanding of our relationship to God. So we need to unpack that. What does that mean? We've got a few things here that I want to read to you and help you begin to understand this. So I'm going to just read these word for word. One of them is up there. First one comes from a professor I had in seminary. His name is Roy Zook. He says, to fear God means to acknowledge his superiority over man. to recognize his deity and thus respond in awe, humility, worship, love, trust, and obedience. The fear of God properly understood was no mere attitude, involved the full range of humanity's response to the deity. So Zook is emphasizing the idea that when we properly understand the fear of God, we respond to him wholly. Everything about us. Thomas Constable puts it up here. You guys are familiar with his notes. I know you use them in some of our Bible classes. He says in the Old Testament, the fear of God is more than awe or reverence, though it includes both. Fearing God is becoming so acutely aware of his moral purity and omnipotence that one is genuinely afraid to disobey him. Fearing God also includes a loving response to him in worship, service, trust, obedience, and commitment. Temper Longman writes this. He is my go-to Old Testament theologian, especially of the book of Proverbs. He says, but why fear? Why don't we start with the love of God as the beginning of wisdom? To answer this question, we explore what exactly it means to fear in this context. The Hebrew word, yarat, can be used of everything from anxiety to horror. There does not seem to be an exact English parallel to the sense in which it is meant here. But fear here certainly does not point to the type of fear that makes someone run away and hide like Adam in the Garden of Eden. Some suggest the word should be understood as respect, but that word seems inappropriately weak. Perhaps the closest English word that we have is awe. But even that word does not quite get it. The fear of the Lord is the sense of standing before God who created everything, including humans, whose very continued existence depends upon him. The emotion is appropriate for wisdom because it demonstrates acknowledgement that God is so much greater than we are. He takes our breath away and makes our knees knock together. Such fear breeds humility and signals a willingness to receive instruction from God. This fear is not the fear that makes us run, but it's the fear that makes us pay attention and listen. Fear of the Lord makes us humble, a wisdom trait rather than proud and being wise in our own eyes. This is why fear, rather than love, is the appropriate emotion for the wise. The fear of the Lord inevitably leads to obedience. The one who fears God will follow the advice that God imparts through the sages in the chapters of instruction in the book of Proverbs, and he goes on. Many of you are C.S. Lewis fans. I think some of you are in that class right now with Dr. Hicks. And he has the perfect, I think, a wonderful analogy of this in the Chronicle of Narnia. We capture the dialogue here. Mr. and Mrs. Beaver are talking to their children about the coming encounter with Aslan, the great lion, king of Narnia. He's the Jesus figure in the story. Susan and Lucy are understandably afraid to meet the lion. Oh, says Susan, I thought he was a man. Is he safe? I feel rather nervous about meeting a lion. That you will, dearie, and make no mistake, said Mrs. Beaver. If there's anyone who can appear before Aslan without their knees knocking, they're either braver than most or just plain silly. Then he isn't safe, said Lucy. Safe? Said Mr. Beaver. Who said anything about safe? Of course, he isn't safe, but he's good. He's the king, I tell you. The fear of the Lord, it involves understanding the wrath of God, but it also involves understanding the love of God. And because of that wrath, there is a reverence and an awe that we are to have for God. He is in control. He is the creator of this world. He is the king of this world, so to speak. But there's also an element of love, which should cause us to have a deep devotion to him, and should cause us to not want to disappoint him. You see, that's a healthy fear. An unhealthy fear is we're worried about the things of this world. We're worried about what's going to happen here. We're worried about those irrational things that can take place. Proverbs 7, again, or Proverbs 3:7 and 1:7, both tell us this. What it says. The fear of the Lord is the beginning of true knowledge, but the fool despises wisdom and discipline. And then he reverses it in chapter 3. He said, don't be impressed with your own wisdom. You're a fool. Instead, fear the Lord and turn away from evil. And how do we do that? By having that proper fear of God. So I want to conclude today by going back to the question that I asked before, and what are you trusting in chapter 3 and verse 5 about the idea of trust? Is it God or is it self? It's presented in the text. Those are kind of our two options. Obviously, the right answer, you're all good Bible college students, should be God. But the reality is, too many times, we fall on the self side. And then in verse 7, what do we fear? Do we truly fear God? So much so that we are in awe of him, and so much so that we are totally devoted to him? Or do we worry about the fears of this world? The things that we can be afraid of here. And they may be worthy of a temporary scare, but in light of eternity, they're temporal things. The fear of the Lord, the fear of God, is something that should drive our every emotion. So what? What's the conclusion of this? I'm going to jump forward in wisdom literature to let my friend Solomon answer this for us. Look what he says at the conclusion of Ecclesiastes. Ecclesiastes is a fascinating book. It's a rather depressing book if you really read it carefully. And in the end of it, Solomon goes through and he starts talking about all these different things, this and this, but look at this, but this happens here. Man, it just seems crazy. And then he comes to this conclusion. Now all has been heard. Here is the conclusion of the matter. We are to fear God and keep his commandments. For this is the duty of every one of us. For God will bring every deed into judgment. Those sins that get whispered into our hearts, God is going to see those. He will judge them. No one else may see them, but he will. Including every hidden thing, whether it is good or evil. Sin whispers to the wicked deep in their hearts. Why? Because we have no fear of God. I want to share these two concluding thoughts here, and I'm going to get over here so I can see a little bit better without falling off the stage. In the Bible, this comes from a theologian by the name of John Frame, and he writes this, and he's talking about in the context of a biblical ethic that we should live by. So he says in the Bible, there are levels of reality, the divine and the non-divine, the creator and the creatures, that is, God or us. There is the reality of God, and there's the reality of our world that we live in. The creator has ultimate power and authority. The creator or the creature does not. The ethical importance of this fact is staggering. In every ethical decision, the first consideration must be how that decision will affect our relationship to God. That's to live in the fear of the Lord? How will what I'm about to do affect my relationship to God? Pastor Greg Rochelle says it this way: the fear of the Lord is that ongoing attitude of my heart of awe and love for God that moves me to decide over and over again to obey him, even when it would be easy or easier to do something else. You see, the fear of the Lord should motivate us to look to God and consider what we're doing, how we're doing it, what's before us. And in the end, out of love and devotion for God, and because of who he is, and out of reverence and awe for God, to do what is the right thing to do. Fear God and keep his commandments. That's our choice. When sin whispers to us, what are we going to choose? God or self? Let me pray. Father, I thank you for this opportunity that we have to look at your word. We thank you for your word. It's truth. It's guidance for us. And we as an institution believe so dearly in that. We make everybody take at least 30 Bible credit hours. We want everybody to have a Bible major because of how important we know your word is. But we do that not just to learn it. We want to live it. We want to experience it. We want to act on it. We want to make our decisions based on our understanding of your word. We want to know the right truth and how to apply it in this real world at the right time for ourselves and to others that we may speak to. Lord, help us to have a proper fear of you, a fear that is in awe and that understands your love for us. And out of that gives us and brings to us a desire to live in a way that is pleasing and obedient to you. Lord, that's my prayer for every one of us, self-included, here in this room. And Lord, I ask that you will honor it in us. And we ask these things in Jesus' name. Amen.